many of Islamic university students when he patronized them there at Erfurt University, and I had a very good experience with him. He is a man of. He is very well known for his book on Islam in South Asia. He is now, at the moment, an emeritus professor at the University of Erfurt, Germany. He specializes in Islamic studies with a focus on Muslim cultural and religious history. And we can say that his extensive academic career spans over 3 decades, where he held a prominent position at renowned institutions like Erfurt University, Bamberg University, and Derby University. Professor Malik has a deep expertise in Muslim societies of South Asia, Islamic historiography, religious pluralism, and cultural dynamics of Muslim communities in Europe. His interdisciplinary approach integrates religious studies, sociology, and historical analysis. He got his PhD in Islamic studies from Heidelberg University in 1988. He is also a member of the European Academy of Science and Arts, Salzburg, fellow of many academic institutions throughout the world, and he will be talking to us about as you can see the title, what is that? Literary salons in South Asia. You know, South Asia is a very rich Muslim land, in fact. The culture of over 1,000 years, in fact. And very rich, but very little studied. Many people don't know. We talk about Andalus, we talk about other areas, but the achievements of Indian culture, Indian scholars, Indian Islamic civilization, never attracted the attention of majority of Muslim scholars outside subcontinent. So today we are with an expert in front of us, mashallah, and especially the literary salons are something very dear to us. Although these days we don't have many of them, but in Qatar we have. Her Royal Highness Sheikh Moza has her own saloon. Saloon is Sheikh Moza. I don't know whether many of you people know that. That is one of the literary salons here in Qatar. And it is not the product of modern Western societies. In Islam, even before Islam, this has been there from the time we know civilization. All great philosophers, they came out of these salons were able to produce Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. These are the salons that produce so many ulamas in our Muslim history. Maybe we can consider the saloon of our majlis of Sayyida Sukaina bint al-Hussein radiyallahu ta'ala anha to be the first literary saloon in Islamic history. Great ulamas used to attend that. And the tradition was continued throughout the Muslim history, in fact. And in Western societies, we have from 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, we know these salons, and most of the modern philosophers of the West were the product of these type of salons. In Indian culture, these salons were very productive. He will be telling us about that. Inshallah, the floor is yours. We are listening to you. You will have, inshallah, because we are starting very late. Maybe you would like to have around 45 minutes or something.
Yes, well, thank you very much for this very nice and elaborated introduction. Thanks very much for having me here, Mudassar Saab, and of course, Dheen Mohamed Saab, and all of you. Welcome to this lecture. And in fact, I'm excited today to to delve into this rich tradition of Mushaira, a forum of yes, okay, that's better. Okay. A poetic gathering basically that thrived in the 18th century India, Muslim India. Now, while these events may seem like simply poetic recitals, they held profound significance, as you already pointed out. There were spaces where poets, thinkers, and intellectuals like Khwaja Mīr Dard, this will be our hero today, and of course others like Mir, Taqi, Mir, and so on, convened to exchange powerful ideas, critique authority, and explore vital spiritual and philosophical questions. This leads us to a crucial question. Can we consider the Mushaira not just a poetic tradition, but a genuine contribution to modernity in Islam? And this, goes together with some sort of a project that I've been following up. Is there something like an Islamic autochthonous or alternative modernity? Now, by modernity in Islam, I refer to the evolution of thought and culture within, of course, the Islamic world that embraces individual agency, critical reflection, and societal reform, while remaining rooted in spiritual values. Similar to the Salons of Enlightenment Europe, these gatherings allowed poets to emphasize reason, to critique social norms and articulate both personal sorrows and broader social concerns. Figures like Dard used the platform not only to express their spiritual longings, but also to engage with pressing social issues. The Mushaira became a vital and public platform for cultural expression, a place where emotion and intellect intertwined to shape the discourse of the time. Now, in the following talk, we will examine the Mushaira's role as a space for personal agency and cultural exchange, and how it served as a vehicle for new ideas. Importantly, we'll also connect the Mushaira to the so-called very kind of nascent idea of Islamic enlightenment, exploring how Muslim intellectuals such as Mir and Dard engage with emerging ideas during the transformative period of the 18th century. Now, with this in mind, let's begin by exploring the historical context of the Mushaira to understand how these gatherings functioned as spaces of cultural expression during the times of significant political and social upheaval, and to see if they truly contributed to modernity in Islam. So let's see how that works. Okay. Well, to fully appreciate the role of the Mushaira in 18th century South Asia, we must examine the historical setting. Consider what happens to a culture when the empire that nurtures it becomes or begins to crumble. Following Emperor Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the Mughal Empire began to decline, already was in decline. This political instability allowed regional powers like Awadh, Bengal, and Hyderabad to rise, each establishing courts that patronized culture and, especially the entrepreneurs were very active in this patronage. And especially, of course, poetry. As the Mughal Empire fragmented, Persian, once central to administration and court culture, began to lose prominence. This decline made way for vernacular languages, such as Urdu, to emerge as a dominant literary language of the new urban elites. For instance, notable poets like Mīr Mīr emerged during this time, capturing the cultural transition through their works. This linguistic shift signaled a broader cultural transformation. The Mushaira became a crucial space for poets to assert their cultural independence. By adopting Urdu, poets positioned themselves at the forefront of this cultural transformation, using their poetry to address emotional, intellectual, and societal issues distinct from the Persianate traditions of the Mughal court. As an Urdu critique tells us, it is the final choice of Urdu that marks the beginning of the emancipation of the mind from the darkness of didacticism and crude expression. And another says that that this poetry in the Mushaira was not religious, but secular. He says it's ghair mazhabi. Its temperament was the enemy of clericalism. Now, these were two brief quotes. Now, originally, a poetic gathering, the Mushaira, evolved into a vital cultural institution during this time. Poets shared and critiqued each other's work while engaging in intellectual debates about society, governance, and morality. For instance, the discussions at Mushairas often reflected the social upheavals of the time, mirroring the anxieties of a changing world. With the empire in decline and regional powers rising, these gatherings became more than just literary recitations. They transformed into forums for vibrant intellectual exchange, where ideas could be discussed and refined. The 18th century saw heightened emotional sensitivity. Now, according to some research, sensitivity was a mood or was a phenomena of the 18th century in particular, right? So, heightened emotional sensitivity in response to the decline on the one hand, and which was, for example, reflected in the Shar-e-Ashob genre. This is, how would you explain that? The city's lament or the shattered city, right? Poets like Mīr Mīr expressed grief over the collapse of cities like Delhi, as seen in the following verse. He says, Meer's heart and soul are steeped in pain. How long will Delhi desolate remain? Now, just to give you a very brief glimpse of that, I think, very important genre of the 18th century. Through such poetry, Mushairas became essential spaces where poets processed both personal and collective anxieties. They used Urdu to articulate their emotional and intellectual concerns, allowing listeners to connect deeply with their experience. As regional courts began to patronize these gatherings, Mushairas evolved into formal institutions that further promoted the cultural shift from Persian to Urdu. Unlike Persian, which was tied to the Mughal imperial project, Urdu was seen as more accessible. This accessibility enabled the new urban elite and also the merchants to express their anxieties, hopes, and aspirations while reflecting the broader social and political changes of the time. This shift was echoed in various contemporary cultural gatherings worldwide, actually, such also in salons in Europe, where literary figures came together to discuss ideas amidst political change. Moreover, these gatherings became catalysts for social discourse, where poets addressed issues like identity, belonging, and cultural dislocation. As we have seen, poetry became a powerful tool for processing societal collapse and expressing grief. What role do you think poetry can play in times of political upheaval? The diverse backgrounds of poets and patrons enriched the discussions, creating a dynamic space for artistic and intellectual collaboration. Now, having explored the emotional and political backdrop of Mushaira, let's now turn to its role as a space of personal agency and intellectual change and exchange. So the Mushaira obviously was much more than a place for poets to gather and recite their verses. It served as a vibrant space where ideas were exchanged. Poets, patrons, and audiences engaged in dialogue, critique, and social interaction. Much like today's open MIC nights, where poets share their work in front of a supportive audience, the Mushaira created an alternative environment where people could cross social boundaries and let ideas flow freely. Now, what made the Mushaira stand out was its open atmosphere. Unlike other elite spaces, it welcomed individuals from diverse backgrounds: aristocrats, scholars, merchants, and even artisans, barbers, masons, weavers, tailors, and so on. This inclusivity allowed the Mushaira to rise above social hierarchies, making it a powerful platform for exchanging ideas, critiques, and emotions. For example, modern literary festivals like the Lahore Literary Festival echo this spirit of inclusivity by bringing together diverse voices and fostering rich dialogues that transcend cultural and social boundaries. One of the most interesting aspects of the Mushaira was its challenge to traditional power structure. While patrons provided financial support, it was the poets whose words held power, shaping intellectual and cultural discourse in ways that transcended traditional hierarchies. For instance, the Naqshbandi Sufi Khwaja Mīr Dard's Mushairas were known for their egalitarian nature. Even the Mughal emperor participated as a regular attendee without displaying his power, illustrating the intellectual respect expected in these gatherings, right? Dard ensured that discussions centered on spiritual and philosophical themes rather than political power. He says, "In my assembly, O Dard, do not speak of kings. If at all, the discourse may be only about Ibrahim Azam," which was, in the 8th century, a Sufi saint, and so on and so on. So, this reflects the power of ideas in these gatherings, where even the emperor participated as a peer, illustrating the intellectual respect fostered in the Mushaira. Okay. Poets and audience, right? Healthy competition was also encouraged. So you see, on the one hand, the social boundaries are torn down, then you have a healthy competition that was encouraged. Poets often responded to one another's work on the spot, creating the environment for peer review, where ideas could be improved and challenged. The Ustad-Shagird, master and student relationship, was central to the Mushaira culture, right? Young poets learned from their masters while also contributing fresh ideas, ensuring the intellectual rigor of the Mushaira. This dynamic allowed them to refine their crafts under the guidance of established masters, similar to today's workshops, no? Where young writers engage in similar peer review processes and so on. Now, these critiques were not always easy to hear, of course. The Mushaira culture demanded that poets be open to robust feedback from both their peers and the audience. This openness fostered intellectual growth, helping poets gain social recognition and advance in society. The audience played an active role too, often challenging poets, questioning their metaphors, or interrupting with critique. I attended a poetry slam recently where the audience not only applauded but also shouted prompts for the poet, turning the performance into a dynamic dialogue that mirrored the interactions at the Mushaira. Now, this dynamic interaction made the Mushaira a lively space where the relationship between poet and audience was constantly evolving. So you might think of some sort of a democratization, right, of the intellectual discourse. The active participation of the audience added even more meaning to the Mushaira. So they weren't just there to listen. They helped shape the event's direction by engaging directly with the poets. This interaction transformed the Mushaira into a bustling center of intellectual and cultural exchange, where ideas were tested and refined in real time. ये क्या है? Okay.
Should I handle this?
Yeah, yes, okay. Another genre that thrived in the Mushaira was Wassucht. Wassucht, sort of a disenchantment, a form that reflected both personal and societal frustration, right? Offering a sharp critique of the moral decay and instability of the time. Sauda, another Urdu poet, known for his satires and a master of Wassucht, wrote, "There was a passion of a different kind. A misunderstanding clouded the mind. But when the time for testing came to be, what was expected, it turned out not to be." So through Wassucht, poets used personal betrayal, actually. Personal betrayal as a lens to address broader social and political issues. Much like Sauda's reflection on personal and societal frustration, contemporary poets tackle urgent issues like climate change nowadays and social justice, using their voices to spark conversation and drive change. In both contexts, competition and critique played a crucial role. The Mushaira was not only a venue for artistic expression, but also a powerful tool for social commentary. Poets used their verses to reflect on the moral and political challenges of their time, engaging in meaningful discussions with their peers, patrons, and audiences. The interactive and competitive nature of the Mushaira fostered a rich intellectual environment that transcended mere poetry performances. In this space, poets asserted their agency through both intellectual and creative exchange. The Mushaira allowed them to rise above social roles, challenge norms, and contribute to the intellectual life of their era. This egalitarian atmosphere, the focus on peer critique and active audience participation, made the Mushaira a unique cultural and social institution. So I'm trying to kind of swift out, certain traits that we can put together in the puzzle of modernity, right? Moreover, the Mushaira was a starting point for new ideas. Poets not only sharpened their thoughts, but also introduced fresh concepts that challenged societal norms and redefined cultural identities. These gatherings created an environment where creativity and intellectual growth could flourish. They ultimately expanded what poetry could achieve in society. The Mushaira functioned as a platform for agency and exchange, allowing poets and audiences to navigate and challenge social norms while fostering cultural transformation. Just as the Mushaira shaped new ideas and conversations of its time, contemporary poetry continues to play a pivotal role in addressing the complexity of modern society, you see. Now, with this in mind, an understanding of the Mushaira as a space of intellectual exchange and agency, let's now explore how it contributed to broader cultural transformation and new ways of thinking. Beyond performance, the Mushaira became a breeding ground for innovative ideas. It was a place where poets explored cultural freedom, social critique, and intellectual innovation, using their poetry to challenge social norms and hierarchy, and of course, to find their identity, right? This identity issue is very important. The Mushaira provided a setting where poets had the freedom to fully express themselves, often using a pen name. It's called the takhallus. Now, the figure of the takhallus is very interesting, derived from takhallasa min, to free yourself from something. So you can argue to free yourself from the taqleed, from the barriers we have in order to have this ijtihad, and new things open up. That's very important. So the pen, the takhallus, to reflect their emotional and intellectual identity, allowing them to transcend traditional societal roles. So it's a detachment from the conventional, right? And the distance thus created from the self helped to objectify one's own subject, and consequently to animate a new identity. For instance, Khwaja Mīr Dard received the pen name Dard, meaning pain, from his father, Andalib, and his pen name was Andalib, Nasser Andalib, which means a nightingale, who, by the way, At the height of the Sunni-Shia conflicts in a tormented Delhi in 1741, presented his work, famous work, The Lament of the Nightingale, Nala Andalib, in which he demanded a radical inner worldliness and moral accountability through what he called the true Muhammadan path, Khalis Tariqa Muhammadiyah. That's also very important for our discussion on so-called Islamic modernity. So, Khwaja Mīr Dard reflects deep spiritual longing and his role as a prominent figure in the ethical teachings of the Muhammadan path, the Tariqa Muhammadiyah. Dard's poetry combined mysticism and social critique, highlighting his dual identity as a Sufi and as a thinker or intellectual. In one of his verses, Dard writes, and this taken, Dard's verses are taken from his Urdu divan. It's a very short divan compared to the divans of Mir Taqi Mir and Sauda and so on. But what is important in his divan, why he became one of the four pillars of Urdu language, is that he's the first who brings in the Sufi ideas in Urdu poetry. He's supposed to be one of the first, right? So, in one of his verses, he says, दर्द दिल के वास्ते पैदा किया इंसान को, वरना ताआत के लिए कुछ कम न था कुरूबियाँ, which means man is created for the pain of love, dard dil. Were there not enough angels for obedience? Now, what does this verse actually suggest about the balance between worldly love and spiritual love and devotion? It reflects on the purpose of human existence. Okay. It reflects on the purpose of human existence, emphasizing the tension between worldly love and spiritual love. For Dard, poetry was a way to express the deepest emotions. It connects with the audience and encourages them towards self-awareness and social responsibility. The purpose of poetry for him was to express this innermost feelings, right? He's also called a very sensitive poet. Next slide. The Mushaira also allowed poets to improve and transform well-known literary forms like the ghazal and masnavi. Although these genres were not new, poets used them to explore complex social and political themes. The ghazal, which traditionally focused on love and loss, became a way to discuss social issues. Through the language of longing, poets expressed not only personal sorrow but also the frustrations with society. Allegory and metaphors became powerful tools for critiquing political and social conditions, and poets wrapped their critique in poetic language, questioning power without direct confrontation. In politically unstable times, this indirect form of critique allowed them to raise sensitive issues while avoiding political backlash, of course. Next, this thing. They actively reshaped literary traditions to reflect the new realities of the world. This ability to innovate within established forms allowed poets to keep traditions alive. This is also very important, right? Modernity does not mean a total break of tradition. No? Modernity also kind of develops on the pillars of tradition. They introduce fresh ideas and perspectives. Through these innovations, the Mushaira became a place where debates on identity, social justice, and governance flourished. The poets who participated used their art to address the moral and political challenges of their time. They offered new visions of society that challenged the status quo. But how did these gatherings transcend mere poetry recitations to influence social society? The answer lies in the Mushaira's unique role as a crucible for new ideas. By challenging social norms and engaging in critical dialogue, poets transformed their craft into a powerful tool for social critique and cultural innovation. They used established literary forms like ghazal to explore not only personal emotions but also broader social issues, weaving allegory and metaphor into their critiques of power. Now, with this understanding of the Mushaira as a catalyst for cultural innovation, let's now explore how it contributed to what we can understand as an Islamic enlightenment. Okay. One of the most profound roles of the Mushaira, of which Dard was the first to revive, and he was a Naqshbandi Sufi, which, by the way, the Naqshbandi Sufi order is a quite Puritan order, and insofar it is in a way strange also that he was the one who kind of, revived this Mushaira tradition. Not only that, he also was fond of music, which again, an issue among the Naqshbandis, not to listen to that. Sama. So, the intellectual movement within the Mushaira focused on spirituality, mysticism, and social reform. No, that's fine. No, that's fine. Instead of encouraging individualism as detached from society, where personal goals were prioritized, the Mushaira fostered personal growth that was closely linked to communal responsibilities and moral duties. Okay. Shah Waliullah, you must have heard his name, a very famous reformer in South Asia, 18th century, was a contemporary of Mīr Dard. His concept of ananiya, I-ness, selfhood, and so on, we might kind of want to reread that as well in terms of a universal identity. Emphasized that individual development should align with societal needs. In the Mushaira, personal identity was explored, not in isolation but in conjunction with political growth, always aimed at improving society. So, the common good, maslaha if you want so. So Shah Waliullah's teaching emphasized that personal ethical development should align with societal progress. So a professional ethical interpretation, that was. Poetry became a means of contributing to the collective moral and social fabric. For example, Khwaja Mīr Dard, who adopted the pen name Dard to reflect his deep spiritual longing and introspective nature. Influenced by his father Andalib, who actually was the key figure in the Muhammadan path, the Tariqa Muhammadiyya, Dard's poetry became a powerful expression of both mysticism and social critique. His work often connected personal introspection with social action, as seen in the following verse. जिस तरह हमने यार के कौल पर क्या इख्तियार, पाई राह मोहम्मदी जो कौल था कि हकदार हूँ हैं हम. So we took the Prophet's words to heart and thus became worthy of the Muhammadan path. This verse emphasizes the importance of following the Prophet Muhammad's example, not only spiritually, but also in terms of social engagement. For that, the Prophet served as both spiritual guide and a paradigm for social and political reform. So we see here that mystical piety is being transformed into what we call in religious studies prophet or action piety. So highlighting social engagement. The Mushaira became a space where spirituality and social responsibility were deeply connected. Dard used Sufi mysticism to address the crisis of the time. Next. Now, this prominent Sufi Urdu poet exemplified this connection between mysticism and responsibility. His reinterpretation, for instance, of the Naqshbandi principle Safar Dar Watan, journey into the homeland, right? Introspection, into Watan Dar Safar. Homeland in the journey or during the journey illustrates that the spiritual journey is not static, but an ongoing process of moral growth, as captured in his verse. "Eh hum watnan, ab ki ye ghurbat ज़्यादा हरगिज़ फिरने का नहीं, उम्र के मानंद सफर से." That is, "O my countrymen, this time this stranger never will return as old age does not return from the journey." Now, this metaphor of life's journey highlights that once a person embarks on their spiritual and moral path, there's no turning back. The ethical and spiritual evolution continues throughout life, leading to the integration of the divine into one's being. This reflects the Sufi progression from fana to baqa. In this way, the seeker returns to the material world with a transformed consciousness. That is a major trait of the Naqshbandiya Mujaddadiya. That's a post-Ibn Arabian phenomenon. The descent after the ascent. Next, please. Dard also emphasized the role, that's interesting, in his Ilmul Kitab, in his, Ilmul Kitab, a major work of his, which he wrote after, the educated classes left Delhi following Ahmad Shah's Durrani's attack on the city in 1747. Now, he also emphasized the role of intellectual reflection, aqli, in understanding divine truth. In his work, this opus magnum, Ilm al-Kitab, he discussed intellectual revelation He calls it kashf-e-aqli, where truth are uncovered through deep contemplation and reflexivity, tafakkur, a key aspect of Sufi traditions of the 18th century. For Dard, the intellect was a tool for deepening spiritual insight and guiding moral action. Only through the application of the intellect could the manifestations of God be recognized, he said. You see. Now, one of the key contributions of the Mushaira was how Sufi ideals were used to reimagine modernity. Poets in their gatherings proposed an alternative vision of modernity rooted in Islamic principles of justice and community welfare, and which were, of course, symbolically represented in a religious tradition. This was, the tradition, the discourse. Rather than viewing divine ideals as distant or abstract, they believed these principles should guide daily actions. Individuals were responsible for holding these ideals. You see the Prophet as a paradigm, somebody who has to be followed and emulated. While modernity in other contexts often highlights individualism and maybe also secularism, the poets of the Mushaira embraced a form of modernity rooted in justice, communal welfare, and moral responsibility, emphasizing individual agency and critical reflection within a framework that was symbolically represented by their religious tradition. In their view, divine ideals were not distant or abstract. They were accessible and applicable to human life. And here I bring in something, the idea of the humanization of the sacred. That meant that divine principles should guide everyday action, and individuals, as moral agents, had the responsibility for holding these spiritual concepts, the ideals, spiritual concepts that were more acceptable to everyday people through these images and the poetry. Now you have this humanization of the sacred on the one hand, and then in return you also have the sacralization of the human. Emphasize that humans, through their actions, could reflect divine will, elevating human experience to the level of profound importance, almost treating them sacred. Okay. This connection, these are 2 points that need to be elaborated yet. You should do that, okay, in your work, in your theses, and so on. This connection between the sacred and the human had significant implications, I would argue, for the social and political vision of the poets. It was this notion that fueled the intellectual movement of the Mushaira, where poets like Dard were not only reflecting on personal spirituality and so on, but also engaging with broader concepts of social justice and reform. And they expressed it in a language that resonated with the audience's personal experiences. Dard's reflection on human agency emphasizes that while divine will governs the world, humans have the power to shape their destiny. ये भी है. This belief in human agency was central to the Sufi movement of the 18th century, and also to Dard's Mushaira, where poets saw individuals as moral agents with responsibilities towards society. In one of his verses, Dard writes, इंसान की ज़ात से ही खुदाई के खेल हैं, बाजी कहाँ बिसात पे अगर शाह ही नहीं. So God plays his game with man, right? But where's the chessboard if the king is missing? So this metaphor suggests that while divine will is always present, human participation is essential, just as a chess game cannot proceed without its king. Dard highlights the crucial role of human agency within divine governance. And through poetry, the Mushaira was not only a space for personal expression, as we see, but also a forum for innovation and social critique. Poets used their verses to challenge the political and social structures of their time. They imagined a society rooted in justice and ethical leadership. The Mushaira's emphasis on ijtihad and moral responsibility inspired critical engagement with both religious and social structures. They seem to offer a vision of governance and community life rooted in Islamic principles, or principles that symbolically represented Islamic tradition. Next slide, please. Yes. The Mushaira was not a space for mystical contemplation. It was a forum for critiquing political and social structures. Poets called for justice and ethical leadership and community welfare, proposing new visions rooted in spiritual and ethical values. These collective efforts towards social progress sought to unite diverse communities, just bringing together the people under the shared spiritual and ethical principles of the Tariqa Muhammadiyya. Now, this Tariqa Muhammadiyya was not a Sufi order, I would argue, but it's an ethical concept, right? Of which Dard was a leading theoretician. I think now the final slide. As we turn to the question posed at the beginning of the lecture, did the literary saloon of the 18th century India constitute a contribution to modernity in Islam? Question mark. We are reminded of the profound role these gatherings played in shaping both individual and collective consciousness in 18th century Muslim India. The Mushairas were not only poetic contests, but spaces imbued with spiritual significance that facilitated a unique interplay between elevating human experience and making philosophical concepts more accessible. Through poetry, human emotions, struggles, and intellectual pursuits were given profound importance. At the same time, spiritual and philosophical ideas were brought into everyday discourse, bridging the gap between the transcendent and the tangible. This dynamic fostered deep reflection and personal introspection among poets and participants. Figures like Khwaja Mīr Dard and his father Andalib exemplified how mushairas became venues for exploring individual identity and the human condition within a framework of spiritual thought. By focusing on human experiences and perspectives, these poets highlighted the centrality of human agency, right, and subjectivity, subtly introducing, I would say, anthropocentric themes into their work. In addressing our initial question, we see that the Mushaira were indeed a crucial force in the intellectual and cultural transformation of Indian Muslim society. They offered a space where the boundaries between the human and the spiritual were fluid, and where reflection, personal growth, and individualization could flourish. This emphasis on human experience and individual expression aligns with key aspects of modernity, such as the focus on personal agency, critical reflection, and the questioning of traditional norms. Thus, while we may not have a definite answer, we can conclude that the Mushaira provided an enduring model that contributed to modernity in Islam. It challenged existing norms and offered fresh perspectives on identity, spirituality, and community. By embracing personal introspection and social engagement, the Mushaira significantly impacted South Asia's cultural and social fabric, offering insights that still continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about justice, moral leadership, and the role of culture in social transformation. Thank you very much for your patience and interest.
Thank you very, very much. Very informing and inspiring presentation, really.